the rest. Well, welcome to Black History Conversations. We have people joining us at the moment, which is lovely. We've got folks from all around the world, and we'll make a formal start in a moment or two. We're just letting people come in. So yeah, it's good. This has obviously gone out to an exciting new mailing. We've got some new names here. So Joe, it's good to have you. Where are you joining us from? An iPhone 4. I'm not sure where you are or who you are. We've also got Marie Stewart. Hi, Marie. Oh, lovely. Joe's a PhD student from Leeds University. Now, if you want me to put you on one of our endless mailing lists, then please put your contact details in the chat, will you? Oh, lovely. Oh, nice to see you. iPhone 4. It's good to see you again down in, I can't remember where you're based now. Um, and Subhadra, hi, it's good that you've joined us. And we're also joined by my colleague Garrick Prayog, who helps to co-host this. Simon Faringo is doing the um, uh, backstage stuff, whatever you call it. And we've got June Elizabeth White-Smith Gully, Joanna Robinson, and Dr. Vivian Crawford joining us from Jamaica. That's fantastic. How are you with us, Vivian? We'll just catch up with you in a moment. And we've also got Lucy McCree. So, Supandra, are you around? No, no sound from you. Okay, then. I'm going to start the session formally, like we do for Black History Conversations. Um, uh, and in this process, I explained to you that I'm over here in Australia and it's midnight. So when the words don't come out quite right, you understand what's going on. Okay, then. Ah, lovely. So we've got Sapandra, and she's joining us from a very noisy student centre. So she'd better stay muted. Yes, you'd better. Okay, pop your email in there. Then that's lovely. And if the rest of you mute yourselves, and then you can come in at any stage you want to, or ask, or put your hands up, or whatever you want to do. We operate the session fairly informally. So, da 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 da, here we are. Try and get the right PowerPoint on for this week, which is good. So, it's great to welcome you all to Black History Conversations. This is actually season 12 and it's session 135. So we've welcomed all sorts of wonderful colleagues from all around the world. And today we're welcoming particularly Professor Alan Lester, but also some new guests as well, which is wonderful. And the focus that we're going to take today is going to be about the book. I'm not sure if it's published yet, or I'm over here in Australia, as I say, I haven't managed to follow that up. So, The Truth About Empire, the Real Histories of British Colonialism. Oh, we come face to face with this over here. So yeah, we'll follow on with that. So welcome to you, Alan. We're delighted you're able to join us, and welcome to everyone else. Now, my name's Liz Millman. I'm one of the directors of Learning Links International, and I'm just welcoming you, and I'll try and make sure the session goes through smoothly. We can have conversations and discussions. And also we've got some additional information to share if we've got time. Now, because I'm in Australia, I'd like to begin with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live at present. That's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Got very interesting things going on here in Victoria. I am just outside Melbourne. So, and it's the tradition for, well, not the tradition, it's the good practice for any meeting, any TV program might have an acknowledgement. Shopping centres have acknowledgements of the traditional owners, schools have acknowledgements. It's really very important for us here. And in fact, recently they started renaming the cities. And there was quite a lot of pushback, needless to say, because this was on Indigenous Peoples Day, I think, in the world, that they renamed all our cities. I'm in Naarm in the south, which is reasonably easy to pronounce. But then, oh, it's Mother Language Day. But then, and as you can see from various bits of information, this was actually not the year before last, but I just wanted to emphasize that. And each week we try and do a little bit of learning about the situation here in Australia. We've yet to have a speaker from here and from our First Nations peoples, because it's either 1 o'clock in the morning, or now the hour's changed, at least it's only midnight. So as you can see, it was quite hard going at that stage. But this is more recently that there's a commission in going on here in Victoria, where people are sharing their stories, and so this is a link to that as well. And gradually, people are becoming more aware. And that sounds unbelievable when you're in a place like Australia, but really there's not been much conversation or information on TV or anywhere else about the frontier wars, they call them now, the Aboriginal resistance. And nice to know that that this art exhibit won at the Venice Biennale. It demonstrates a family tree going back 65,000 years. So if you can see on the walls of the gallery, the artist in chalk on blackboard paint went back and presumably imagined names from a long time back, but it's just incredible. And then all those piles of paper on the front are all the cases of First Peoples incarceration in Australia. So it's a really very significant piece. But while we were thinking of acknowledgements, we wanted, as Black History Conversations, to make an acknowledgement, and that is to the injustice of the actions taken by the British and other European countries that invaded and took possession of the islands of the Caribbean Sea, as well as the continents of North and South America. In addition, we also recognise the exploitation of the great continents of Africa, Asia, Australia, and many other parts of the world in the centuries of colonisation. Myself. Right, I've unmuted myself now, so you can read what I was saying. I won't catch up, but acknowledge that this resulted in the destruction and destabilisation of so many nations, peoples, and cultures. And we've also been following up over the time activities being undertaken during the International Decade of People of African descent. So I'll just stop sharing there, which I shouldn't have pressed that one. So welcome to those of you who've joined us just now. Just going back to the PowerPoint, the next one was just to say that you can catch up on what's happening online. There's lots of information that you can discover that's been shared over the last 10 years, and I'm sure there'll be more information to come. Right, a couple of weeks ago, we welcomed Atinuka. She was discussing her brilliant book, Brilliant Black British History, an absolute classic. This is a great book. And even if you're not a child, as most of you aren't, it's worth getting hold of a copy out of the library or whatever. It's a really, really good read, and really tells the longer, much longer story of Black British history. And then last week we welcomed Professor Celia Naylor from Columbia University, and she told us about a fascinating project she's been doing, specifically on the Rose Hall plantation estate in Jamaica, looking at the stories of the first well, the enslaved workers there and naming the enslaved workers. So this week we're welcoming Professor Alan Lester. So Alan, introduce yourself and tell us about this subject, please, that you've chosen to share today. And Jackie Pennon, can you switch your microphone off, please? Alan, your mic needs to be switched on.
Yeah, sorry, it kept muting itself for some reason, but I think, can you
Yes,
hear
I
me
don't
now?
know. Mine went off in the middle of that. No, I've got the gremlins in
Yeah.
today.
Okay.
Alan,
No,
I'm so pleased you've been able to join us. So tell us about this. Well, tell us about you and tell us about the book.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. It's a very kind introduction. Yeah, the book's out on the 27th of June. And I think, rather than just sort of give you a long lecture and talk at you for too long about what it's about and what's in it and so on, I will do, as you just suggested, is I'll talk a bit more about sort of the trajectory leading to the book and a bit about me, which doesn't come comfortably to me. It's only relatively recently that I've kind of inserted myself into my academic work, and you're going to find out a bit more why when I tell the story. And I'll give a sort of brief indication of where the book's come from and what's in it, and then we can have a conversation, hopefully, for most of the time, about this broader expanse of the British Empire. So if I start off with a bit about myself, then I was brought up in a white community that was mainly a builder, brought up in Haringey. And we moved out of Haringey when I was fairly young as part of the kind of white flight, with members of my family talking about how the area was being spoilt by the influx of black people and people from Cyprus in particular at that time. And I grew up within this community in which blackness was feared, essentially. And I first started to sort of think in slightly different ways about the world when I watched the film Zulu as a kind of 10 or 11-year-old kid. And although it's still a kind of imperial epic, celebrating white heroism, there was something, some kind of recognition of the bravery of Zulu soldiers. And it started to make me think, why were British soldiers fighting Zulus in Zulu territory? And it obviously wasn't a defensive war. So I started to read a little bit then, and gradually my kind of understanding of Britishness changed the more I read about South Africa and Zulu history in particular. But I think the real turning point came for me when I was really lucky as an undergraduate to get into Cambridge University, so the first generation of my family to go to university. And they had a bursary, a generous bursary scheme. And I managed to go to South Africa using some of that funding to do my dissertation, my undergraduate dissertation. So I arrived at the University of Natal, as it was then, KwaZulu-Natal now, in 1988, so towards the end of apartheid. And my first day there, sort of slightly disorientated and bewildered, I went into the university refectory and got my tray and got some food, and then faced the refectory hall. And the University of Natal was a whites-only university under apartheid legislation. But as a so-called liberal university, it was testing the limits of the law by admitting some black students. But only a handful, as far as I could see, in this refectory. Most of the tables were full of white students. There was one table that had about 12 black students on it. And I went and sat with them thinking I'll probably learn a bit more that way. And immediately, one of them said, "You're not from around here, are you?" And they kind of took me under their wing. And I produced an awful dissertation because for the 6 weeks that I was there, I spent hardly any time in the archives, and most of the time with them and their families, showing this white English guy what life was like in the townships around Pietermaritzburg in late apartheid South Africa. And for me, it was a kind of sliding doors moment. It was pretty sort of mind blowing to see apartheid in practice. They took me to black hospitals, and then I saw white hospitals, black schools, white schools, but just the sheer racialized violence of apartheid was astonishing. And I happened to be in the townships around Pietermaritzburg with ANC supporting students, my new friends, as Inkatha Zulu nationalists backed by the white South African state trying to sponsor what they call black on black violence, were burning and killing people. And you know, my friends had to sort of chaperone me out from some various dodgy situations. So I came home thinking that I needed to try and find out more about this and try to talk to people more about apartheid. Became an academic, and for a long time I wrote about the historical origins of apartheid, tracing them back prior to 1948, prior to the Afrikaner nationalist government, with which apartheid is most closely associated, and looking at the British colonial origins of segregation in South Africa, upon which the apartheid system was constructed. So essentially, my argument in my first sort of few books was that the British colonial rule had laid the foundations for this most extreme racist form of governance in the modern world, by dispossessing African people of land through a series of wars of aggression, confining African people into reserves, and then managing the flow of their labour, this sort of disembodied labour force, to the townships to work in white-owned industries for the benefit of white people. And all of those systems, the reserves, the past controls that managed labour migration, the compounds in which mine workers were housed, and so on, all of this was pioneered by the British. Apartheid was really a refinement of the system of white supremacy that the British had installed to make sure that Afrikaans-speaking whites could benefit from it as much as English-speaking whites. So that was the sort of major argument that I was pushing for the first part of my academic career. But I then sort of broadened out and started to look at British colonialism more extensively. So, you know, apartheid was one case of an extreme form of racism, which could be tracked directly back to British colonial rule. But I started to get interested in what British settler communities in other parts of the world were doing. So I wrote books on Australia and on New Zealand. I became particularly interested in the ways in which white Britons were able to persuade themselves that they were being humane, even as they engaged in these acts. So I started to look at colonial humanitarianism and the kind of rationales that have constantly been sold to the British population over the last 300 years for humane forms of colonization, how they managed to reconcile these clearly inhumane acts with the sense that they were acting humanely. So much of my writing has been about that, about colonial humanitarianism and these rationales that made things seem legitimate to the white British population. But for a very long time, I just sort of worked within the ivory tower, just publishing this stuff as academic work. And then there was a kind of another sliding doors moment, I guess, about 4 years ago when two things sort of coincided. First of all, I got very ill and I spent a long time in hospital with a liver condition and then liver transplant and then cancer, bile duct cancer, which took me out of my normal kind of academic routine. And it meant that I couldn't spend much time away working in archives in Cape Town or in Melbourne or Sydney or wherever anymore. So I needed to sort of try and deploy what academic knowledge I had of the British Empire in different ways. But secondly, it was 2020 that I was spending a lot of time in hospital, and the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Edward Colston's toppling into Bristol Harbour, and then the backlash and denialism started to set in. And I think broadly what changed was that up until it wasn't exactly George Floyd's murder that directly precipitated it, because we'd already had the Roads Must Fall movement in 2015. But up until around this time, most white Britons could still sort of complacently look back on their colonial past and still believe in many of these legitimations, many of these sort of rationales for supposedly humane colonization that I'd been studying all this time. You know, that kind of level of indoctrination was so deep that it would take quite a lot to challenge it. And because Black Lives Matter and the publicity that it generated did challenge those narratives, and particularly with the crystallization of our history in the body of Edward Colston, you know, the fact that someone who was seen as humane, who was celebrated as a philanthropist, whose statue was in Bristol and things named after him in Bristol, streets and buildings and so on, because of his humanity, his philanthropy. The fact that he was able to generate that benevolence through his participation in mass murder, the trafficking of human beings, and that these things were so closely connected, the atrocity and the philanthropy. I suppose it kind of crystallized some of the things that I'd been thinking about for a long time, but it also meant that I was now in a position to try to use what expertise I generated over the last 30 years to do what I can to argue against this backlash and the new denialism that set in. So some of my work over the last few years has been about how empire has figured in the culture war. And much of that culture war, it's not all about colonialism, it's not all about empire. Much of it is targeted at transgender people. A lot of it is targeted at people moving, particularly people coming to Britain to try and claim asylum as refugees and asylum seekers. But a significant part of this right-wing populist culture war that we've seen, not just in Britain, but in other parts of Europe and in the USA, has been about conserving these traditional narratives of Europe being the humane centre that brought civilization and brought progress to the rest of the world by colonizing it. So a large segment of the culture has come to focus on that defense of the legitimacy of empire and of colonialism. So I wrote a book called Deny and Disavow, which is a small publisher kept at a reasonable price to try and make it widely available, and a trade book, which is all about the ways in which, particularly as conservative government, right-wing think tanks, and populist movements have tried to resuscitate, revive, and defend these earlier legitimations for the conquest of other people's land, their enslavement, their exploitation, to try to defend the legitimacy of empire, essentially. And I guess what lies behind quite a lot of what I'm trying to do now, including this truth book, is that while I was sort of sitting there in hospital a lot of the time thinking about what I could do, two things occurred to me. One of them is, where does the problem lie? And the problem doesn't lie so much in the Black community. The problem lies in my community, the community in which I was born and brought up. The problem of this denialism. I wouldn't say it's exclusively in the white community. You just have to look at some of the people jostling to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, some of the most outspoken people, to realise that it's not just within the white community that we have this kind of celebratory defence of empire and an intolerance for anybody challenging those traditional narratives. But by and large, it's in the white community that the problem lies. And as part of that community, I feel an increasing sense of obligation, which I didn't feel for the sort of first 30 years of my career, really, to try and use what tools I have to address my community largely. I'm happy to speak to anybody, but but the audience that I write for primarily is white people who are ignorant of our colonial past and who don't get to overcome that ignorance very easily. So what I'm trying to do is sort of use the resources that are available to me in my trajectory to do something about that. So this book, The Truth About Empire, it's a group of 14 historians, all of them leading specialists in their fields within colonial history. And we've tried to cover quite a large expanse of the globe. And the chapters are organised largely around some of the main talking points of this populist denialism. So we've got chapters, the foreword is written by Satnam Sangera, who recently published Empire World, where he did make a genuine attempt to become au fait with the latest sort of historiographical work. I gave him quite a lot of advice on which historians to read. And Empire Land, I think, is a pretty good survey, popular survey, very well written, as you'd expect from a journalist. He's written a foreword in which he talks about the sometimes kind of rather ridiculous lengths to which this backlash against Black Lives Matter has gone. So he mentions the case of Oliver Dowden, deputy chairman of the Conservative Party now, who after Colston's toppling, said that he would happily chain himself to Nelson to stop his statue being toppled. Kind of how he's going to scale Nelson's column to stand up there, I don't really know. But you've got these ridiculous sort of assertion of Britishness, and police guard statues around the country that weren't even being threatened, and so on. So he's written a foreword which talks about this atmosphere in which academic historians are now working, and in which we get accused of being woke whenever we draw attention to certain uncomfortable truths. Then I do an introduction, and I'm happy to say a bit more about that if you want to later. And then just to run through quickly, I won't name all of the contributors, but just some of the topics that we touch on. We've got a chapter looking at anti-slavery and pointing out that anti-slavery was an African phenomenon well before it was a British phenomenon, and that the British anti-slavery activists like Granville Sharp were inspired by West African leaders who are trying to stamp out the slave trade in their own territory. So, part of this sort of culture war defensive empire is that the British pioneered anti-slavery, and this challenges that narrative. Lyndall Ryan writes about the denialism that took place in Australia and Australia's own history wars, and that preceded our culture wars in the UK, when the right wing in Australia teamed up with the government and with media in the early 2000s to the violence of colonisation and to deny genocide and to deny massacres of Aboriginal people. Lyndall Ryan has been in the forefront of uncovering the empirical evidence for hundreds of massacres across Australia, and particularly for the genocide in Tasmania and Van Diemen's Land. So she talks us through that kind of prior experience of fighting these wars over historical memorialisation and trying to preserve with the truth, despite all of the opposition that one faces as an historian doing that. And we've got a chapter by 3 Canadian authors, one of them an Indigenous First Nations woman, Amiasu Wasupa, talking about the denialism that's rife in Canada at the moment, because this right-wing post-BLM backlash is not just a British thing, it's a transatlantic thing. It's connected with the alt-right and with Trump supporters in the USA. It's also connected with quite a vocal lobby in Canada of alt-right journalists, writers, not generally historians, but people who write about history, denying the impacts of the residential school system on Indigenous peoples, Indigenous cultures, denying policies of starvation to clear First Nations people out of the reserves that were left to them after treaties were broken, and so on. So we've got a chapter on Canada, a chapter on some of the myths about the civilizing mission. When you encounter this right-wing backlash and this re-legitimation of empire, you hear certain things time and time again. The railways in India and the suppression of sati is one of them. The Hindu practice of a widow being expected to throw herself on her husband's funeral pyre, and how the British supposedly suppressed that and brought civilization to India. So we've got a chapter talking about the reality of sati and how much of it was British rhetoric rather than actual suppression, and how what suppression there was mostly conducted by Indian people rather than by as a result of British conquest, and so on. So I won't go through the rest of it, but we cover much of the empire, taking turns with specialist historians challenging some of these myths, some of them very old, some of them relatively new, that are being mobilized now in the wake of Black Lives Matter to re-legitimate empire. And it's still going on. So I'll conclude with just an example from the last couple of days. Since Kemi Badenoch gave a speech in the City of London, which was another denialist speech. She started off by talking about the glorious revolution in 1688, when a new monarchy established conditions for financial security in the City of London. That's fair enough. That probably contributed to rapid economic growth in Britain. But then she went from there into the denialism and saying that too many people go on about colonialism being a factor in Britain's economic growth. And if people believe that around the world, then they won't be able to develop in the way that Britain did if they think it's all down to colonialism. And that sparked the usual sort of culture war rallying cry. It's like a dog whistle to right-wing newspapers like the Telegraph, think tanks like the Institute for Economic Affairs that was behind Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget here. And they started writing ever more denialist stuff, saying slavery, colonialism, the empire contributed virtually nothing to Britain's economic success. So, I was trying to challenge that on Twitter by doing a kind of round the world tour from Britain eastwards, looking at conquest and palm oil extraction in West Africa, Lever Brothers' involvement in Congo, in Belgian Congo, and complicity in genocide, mining in South Africa, coffee and sisal production in Kenya by white settlers, all on indigenous people's land, oil extraction in the Middle East, plunder of India, and then rent extraction, rubber and tin plantations developed through dispossession and indentured labor in Malaya, China, opium wars, forcing free trade and narcotics trade on China for the benefit of British investors, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, USA, displacement of indigenous peoples, commercial farming, cotton from the USA for the Industrial Revolution, and then, of course, the Caribbean itself, which I don't need to tell any of you about, with the enslavement of millions of African people to produce sugar, cotton, tobacco, and help to accelerate Britain's Industrial Revolution. And to deny that vast scope of colonialism and empire is unfortunately a project that has real salience in Britain at the moment, that still appeals to a lot of British people. And this Truth About Empire book, I hope, will do whatever we can. It may be a very minimal contribution, but do what we can to try and combat that. Okay, I'll stop going on there and
Right.
let's.
Well, fantastic. It's going to be lots of points and lots of questions, I'm sure. Welcome to those who've joined us for our conversation today. Just to say thank you, Alan, for introducing yourself so sensitively and personally. That makes a lot of sense. And then also to introduce us to the book and to the background of what it's about. And I'm sure all of us will look forward to getting hold of a copy of the book. I'll be back in the UK then. So for those of you who've joined us more recently, I'm Liz Millman from Learning Links International. I'm joined with my colleague, Garrick Prayog, and also June Elizabeth Whitesmith Gully's with us as well, listening in from the car, I think. We've got colleagues with us from Jamaica. We've got Dr. Vivian Crawford. Greetings to you, Vivian. Excellent that you've joined us. And we've got Ivor, who's joined us from the small community of Pennants. And that's my personal story, Alan, is that my father would never, as a Welshman, would never let us go to Penrhyn Castle. And as an adult, as soon as I could drive, I wanted to go and see what it was all about and find out. And now we've got a project going. We met up again yesterday on Zoom to explore the shared history between North Wales and the communities in the areas where the Pennant family had plantations in Jamaica. So that's been quite an interesting follow through. So, wow, come on then. I need to see some hands up here. So we've got some people, some comments or thoughts. I'm obviously particularly interested. Thank you, Vivian. I'll come to you in a moment. I'm interested in the Australian story because I feel that I've had the opportunity sitting in my room during COVID with nothing much to keep me company other than the TV. But we have a fantastic Indigenous Peoples television channel here, NITV, which has shared a lot of productions of a lot of information. So that's good. June Elizabeth, I'm just switching your. If you want to talk, you're very welcome. But I'll switch your picture off every now and again because it's a bit distracting because it's a lot of movement. Right, okay then. Vivian, would you like to come in next then? You'll have to unmute yourself, Vivian.
Thank you, Liz.
Right,
I say this every week, how grateful I am. And for our participants to be part of this institution I call the Liz Millman Institute, because there is so much we are learning. And to thank Professor Alan for this truly incredible, outstanding presentation. And Prof, as you spoke, I was born in 1066. I should let you know. But I learned this poem when I was 8 years. And I never forget it. It's called a memory gem, which we were taught under colonial education. And I'm going along memory lane to share it with us. Speak the truth and speak it ever. Cast it what it will. He who hides the wrong he did does the wrong thing still. I have to thank you, Professor Allen, and I hasten to ask, to what extent is enslavement taught in primary schools? I notice I didn't say the universities, because sometimes, with respect, in our quest to achieve that degree, to pass that degree, we do not go into the details. But in the primary schools, to what extent is this taught, or is still not taught? Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much for your question. That poem is wonderful. I'd love to get a copy of that if you send it through sometime.
Really?
yeah, thank you.
I'll send it to you.
I mean,
I'll get your email from Liz.
Thank you. Yeah, enslavement is taught patchily in primary schools and also in secondary schools as well before students go to university. So in the national curriculum, this is my understanding from talking to teachers. I used to be a teacher. I did my PhD part-time, but that was a long time ago. But my understanding at the moment is that the national curriculum doesn't prescribe whether or not you could teach slavery, but teachers can teach it as a way of teaching other themes that are prescribed in the national curriculum if they want to. So a lot depends on individual teachers, and where you have academy schools, which all link together, there is an increasing movement. Actually, I quite like this movement because it's quite subversive. These academy schools were established largely to try to enable a more kind of free market orientated conservative style of teaching, away from local authority control. But what's actually happened in a number of cases is that the latitude that they've been allowed is enabling teachers, largely teachers of colour, to teach things like enslavement and colonial history that they might not have got away with teaching previously. So, it's an example of an innovation being used subversively. So there is a growing movement among teachers to teach this stuff. Resources are starting to become available. So I've helped now 2 cooperative networks of teachers who want to develop teaching resources, because that's part of the problem. We don't have the textbooks which deal with this stuff. So they're writing their own. So these collaborations between teachers, educationalists, academics like myself. One of these books that's just been published on the British Empire has a list of about 15 or 20 academics who have helped to produce it. So it's starting to happen, but it is still very patchy. And as far as I am aware, most kids would go through the British education system quite easily without ever being taught anything about transatlantic slavery.
Right, that's interesting. Rose, I don't know if you want to come in as an ex-head teacher, and then Garrick. Rose, about the curriculum.
Yeah. I think it's very patchy and almost a rather than, although you mentioned the national curriculum, frankly, I don't think enough is taught as sensitively, as truthfully as it needs to be. So I am concerned about, and Vivian I think this is a great question, because I am concerned, given the environment in which we are living now, with what you were calling there, Stuart, the denialism, and the sort of rise of what I call, frankly, not just a new right, but almost a level of, I don't know whether I ought to be labeling it fascism. I think it's really important that head teachers in schools, particularly academies where there is more freedom, actually use the new resources carefully, properly, and educate these young people so that they can argue the case for a recognition of historical truth that happened, and the link to economic growth of all of these countries everywhere. So not enough is the answer at primary level, particularly. And I think, frankly, sketchily and not sufficiently robustly at secondary. So those are my little comments about this idea of teaching slavery in both primary and secondary.
Thank you. I think that Vivian, you'll find that interesting from Rose and Vivian, yourself and myself. We're both, I was going to say victims, I can't think of a better word, of a colonial education. All I knew about Jamaica was yellow birds in banana trees. Yes, it's a very good point, that, and it is so important, and it's fundamentally important that white Britons and the descendants of white Britons do understand the history of our empire, because being here in Australia, it's blatantly obvious that a lot of people don't know. Right, I'm going to, Alan, I don't know if you want to come back on any of those points, and then Garrick, over to you. And then maybe Adrian will catch up with you.
Just a quick thing as well. I think the education system obviously needs to do an awful lot more about enslavement and the ways in which the transatlantic system of enslaved people's exploitation transformed the globe as a whole. You know, it transformed Africa, it transformed the Americas, it transformed the Caribbean, and it transformed Europe. That is absolutely fundamental to teach. But there are also other aspects of Britain's broader imperial history about which people are totally and woefully ignorant. You know, so when they think of India, they think of railways. That's what we get again and again on television and in popular media. Most people, if you tell them that the East India Company, as a commercial company, after about 1813, most of its shareholders' dividends came in the form of rent that was charged to Indians for living on their own land in India. They paid rent to the company passed that rent on as profits and as dividends to British shareholders. Most people don't know even very basic facts about the forms of exploitation that existed within empire like that. So it's not just transatlantic slavery, it's broader forms of colonial development or underdevelopment as well. Thanks.
Thank you, and I think that really underlines why it's important that we're having this discussion now, because we can get a bit sidetracked onto the Black history stories of the slave trade, and it's really important that we look at this whole wider issue. Vivian, are you coming back on that?
Oh, well, I didn't intend to, because I thought others, you know, I have a burning question, but when other members have contributed, I will come in at the end.
I'm sure. Okay, only you switch your mic on. Right, Garrick, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Allen, for that very stimulating introduction, just to hear your own experience, particularly the experience in South Africa. And how that has led you to where you arrive at the moment in your journey. It does help to understand individual as to the path they've chosen in life and how they actually navigate their way through life as a result of that. But just listening to some of the points that you've just raised in your presentation, particularly around this issue around empire. And we also have a comedy show that was called Empire Road. I don't know if you remember that. It was Norman Beaton from Guyana, and it's still available, you know, on TV, which was almost taking the empire story and adding some little twist to the empire story in terms of, you know, what the British Empire have done for those people and the influence that it had on individual. So, you know, maybe when you get a chance to have a look at that. But on a more serious note, in relation to slavery being taught in schools, I don't think we should expect that to become a reality in the way that the Eurocentric education system will not really dismantle what they have taught for how many 100 years in order to give you the truth about empire. So that have to come from another source. And that other source is what you've just introduced in your book. And it may be that some of us who are parents and grandparents, then we can actually use this information with our grandchildren in order to give them the other side of education, the bit that they will not get through the curriculum, and the bit that they will not get in university, because university education will be very biased to the Eurocentric side. And so for me, I always draw some comfort from the fact that in Wales, they have taken Black history very seriously for it to be part of the curriculum. And yet in England, they haven't done that. And in Scotland, they haven't done that. So maybe there is some lessons to be learned as to, you know, what good practice exists around primary education in Wales that we can transfer in other places.
Thanks very much indeed. I'll come to you next, Lucy. Thank you, Garrick. And as someone with close links with Wales, it has been interesting to see. But Wales is geographically positioned in a very interesting way, with Liverpool to its north and Bristol to its south. I think it's Professor Chris Evans who said that Wales wasn't rich enough to be able to have a slave trade port of its own, so we had to transport our goods out to these two big centres. But also, I think sometimes we forget about how Welsh people are often taken as part of the English who were around and about the world colonializing, or however you would term that, because the Welsh names are all around the world. And the one thing that Wales exported, interestingly, is evidence. And Dr. Vivian Crawford kindly gave a talk about this for us, is that Wales exported the Eisteddfod. So here in Australia, we've got Eisteddfod, and Eisteddfod in Jamaica and other places. So this is evidence of things that our forefathers were doing around the world, as you're explaining, Alan, in your book. And it's fascinating to hear about the different academics who are contributing to this, because you academics, you've got the knowledge. We're people in the community. We're the ones who need to get it out there. And as an ex-teacher, I realise how difficult it is for our colleagues. Lucy, over to you.
Oh, hi. I was wanting to return to the arena of education and to think how we can use what already is there in how we are meant to be teaching history. So, for example, under the national curriculum, which now doesn't apply everywhere, students were encouraged to ask questions. Very often those questions weren't answered. But if we encourage our children and grandchildren to ask those questions, then the teachers need to respond. And indeed, this is what has happened in some areas of London, for example, where there's been a big education project, which was started because of the demand of students who found that the history they were being taught was not answering their questions and not helping them to understand the world that they're living in. Because for me, what this work does, I mean, I have a white middle-class background with seeped in colonialism, but just because I started asking different questions, I got different answers. And like Alan, I did VSO when I was 18. Well, anything you do at 18 is deeply influential. And I had precisely the same experience as you, Alan, at a service meal in South Africa. It was for museum educators, actually. It was the first one they'd ever had with people from all racial groups. And I went and sat down at a table of Black people thinking, right, I want to start learning. And for the whole of that 4-day conference, I was given amazing information. And there were white South African delegates to that conference who said to me, with whom I shared this information, they said to me, where did you learn that from? And I said, I was lying. I said, oh, people have been so kind. I've talked to everybody I can't remember. And I heard one of the museum educators there saying to the other, I better get this right. I'm meant to be doing an exhibition about this. So it's by using the tools, you know, strong tools of wanting the truth, that we can change things. And the other thing is, lots of work has been done in the past, in the 80s and 90s. Do you all know the work of Sylvia Collicott? She was a teacher in Haringey, Alan, and she wrote a book called Local National World Links. And she's still writing now and working on very specific work in the area where she lives. And I don't want us to lose that work. You know, there's lots of new enthusiasm now and lots of new ideas, but let's reinvent wheels that have already been invented. We need to build on what has already been done.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think it's really interesting that through our conversations that sometimes we are hearing from people who we have to have the greatest respect for us because they've done brilliant work in the past, but perhaps not so many people knew about it. And it's a new opportunity now to share.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm going to move on now and ask Adrian. He's in Jamaica. It's great to see you again, Adrian. You're looking very well. How are you?
Hi, yeah, great, thanks. I'm doing okay. Just started a new job at the forestry department where I'm now based. So that would be odd. I just got this at last minute. But what I wanted to say though is having studied in Wales, to address some of the comments that I was hearing earlier, the challenge is that even if you perceive your history as not being an active role in colonialism, how did you benefit? That's one of the questions. And from a Jamaican standpoint, um, we see the Welsh as participating in colonialism, even if you did not have the ports, because then you're now a part of so the difference between a Jamaica and a Wales is that you're still a first world country. Where did your wealth come from? How did you spend that wealth? A lot of that wealth came from the backs of my ancestors that built your roads, built your castles. Whether it was forced upon you, you perceive it as being forced upon you by the English or not. From the perspective from a Jamaican, we don't care because the challenge is the blood, the literal sweat, the literal tears of my ancestors would have funneled and fueled the benefits that we now live with today. And one of the ways that I explained this to one of, well, mind you, he was an Englishman living in Wales. I gently took his hand and I said, I'm a biologist. Where do you think the nutrition to build your genetics today came from? It came from the cane fields in Jamaica. It came from the breadfruit that we would have shipped to England and Wales, right? So, because when I spoke about slavery and colonialism in Wales, a lot of the retort was, oh, but the generations of today did not contribute to slavery. Actually, you might not have been a slave, but you've inherited the nutrition that makes up the genome that is now in your body. And that was and so one of the things I like to do is put it in the context of not 400 years ago, because a lot of the rhetoric I got was, oh, but this was 400 years ago, and then, oh, but the Romans also conquered the UK. The Romans conquering the UK 1,000 years ago doesn't mean that I don't get to hold you to account. And 400 years ago was three peoples ago. Three. And I gave the context of my great grandfather, who lived 150 years ago and died 50 years ago, right? So he would have died some 30 odd years before I was born. So I'm the great grandchild of someone who would have seen slavery. My grand aunt was 94 when she died in 2004. She was born a couple decades after slavery was abolished. So, and her mother was born a couple decades after slavery was abolished. So I don't know that persons can get away with saying, oh, well, we didn't, whatever. And I kind of have to disagree with Derek a little bit because I find that even the school age children in Wales who are Welsh don't know anything about slavery or colonialism or the types of Black people then and now. So I'm not saying education isn't happening. What I'm saying is whatever education that they're receiving are translating. And Liz would have known about my experience of racism and the sexual harassment in Wales, where in particularly the unlikely group of those who are supposed, so for example, Black men in particular in North Wales are usually the victim of sexual fetishization based on race. And as a part of that victim there when I was studying. So I don't know what kind of education is happening. If you say it's happening, I will take your word for it. I'll whatever. Because I do know that there is a good Black advocacy group which Liz is a part of. So I'll take that as evidence. But my question is, how does that translate to the lived realities of persons, Black people living in Wales? I certainly didn't have a good time. A lot of my Black friends certainly didn't have a good time. So the education
Okay then, Adrian,
is
I'm going to ask you to wrap up now, and it's been so kind that you've joined us, taken time out to join us from Jamaica. We've got another colleague joined us as well, Jonathan Greenland now. Jonathan's the director of the Museums of Jamaica. Adrian, you're making such brilliant points, and these are points that sometimes we've talked through before, because I do know what a rough time you had when you were at Bangor University for that year. And also Garrick says, yes, you're making some very good points. The strategies may be good, but are we seeing the reality? And how's it getting through to all the people who've now gone through the school system? There's a lot of other people to get to in Wales, particularly in North Wales. I'm going to ask Alan now to come in. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adrian. That was really interesting, and I think there's a lot to try and sort of get to grips with in what you were saying. Just a couple of things that I picked up on that I can say something about. I think one of the points you were making was that a lot of people, like many Welsh people, and I've seen this quite a lot on Twitter and elsewhere, in Britain as a whole, not just Wales, will say, well, you know, my family's always been working class. We never owned enslaved people. We never benefited from slavery. Why should we care about this? And it comes into play when one talks about reparations as well. And it's true that the benefits from slave ownership and from participation in transatlantic slavery were very unevenly distributed within Britain, and obviously distributed with a weighting towards the already wealthy and the elites. But there is one statistic that is quite useful to tell people when they say that these benefits did not then cascade throughout the whole of British society. And that's in 1884, the Royal Statistical Society held a meeting at which a statistician called Richard Temple tried to work out how much of the government spending in Britain on basic welfare for all Britons came from within the British Isles, which included Ireland at the time. Ireland was counted as part of Great Britain, and how much of that government spending came from the empire, and only 44% of it came from taxation raised within Britain. So the majority came from colonial exploitation overseas and the extraction of wealth from overseas to supplement British government expenditure for all Britons, which all Britons benefited with from one degree or to another at home. But just another couple of things just to pick up on. Talking about the extent to which things are infiltrating into the education system, and how much hope there is that things are changing. When I sort of start to despair, where I kind of look for a little bit of hope is the sense that much of the intensity of this backlash that we're seeing at the moment is fueled by fear that things are changing, that they're being put on the back foot. And you can see it. It's a visceral backlash against moves which are beginning to get underway. I'll give you one example. One of the people who's been targeted and victimized most in this culture war, obviously it's writers of color like David Olusoga, who has to have a bodyguard now. Satnam Sangera has been threatened a lot. But one of the people who's been threatened, her family have been threatened, she's been sent all sorts of abuse, is Corinne Fowler, who's an academic who's written about the colonial countryside. She's got a new book coming out on it. And I think one of the reasons why she was targeted by the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and this kind of nexus of right-wing reaction is that she was involved in this colonial countryside project, which was with school kids, with primary age school kids, who were learning about the colonial connections in the British countryside, and particularly in stately homes. And this was a well-funded project that was beginning to infiltrate into the school's curriculum. And therefore, it induced this kind of panicked reaction that we mustn't let this happen. So it's a huge nexus that we're fighting against. And the last thing I'll just say is about why this backlash is so well resourced. And it's so well resourced not just because people are inclined to sort of want to celebrate national histories and because of the St. George's Cross waving nationalists. It's also well financed and well resourced, and it's platformed in places like the Telegraph, because many of the think tanks that carry on this culture war about empire are also funded by climate change deniers who are multimillionaires with investments in fossil fuels. And by associating the truth about colonial history with woke environmentalism and with climate change protesters and even climate change science, they are, linking together a whole series of issues that for them they can caricature as woke and which represent their current financial interests and their political interests. And they want a conservative government because they are mostly Tory party donors. They've done very well out of government contracts and out of lobbying and out of political influence. And one way in which they think they can win elections in future, very unlikely to win the next one, but one way in which they think they can fight back against Labour is by wielding this historical denialism and appealing to the social conservatism of voters. Even if they can't appeal to them on any other grounds, this is the culture war is one of the ways in which they can play it. So, the interest that we're fighting against, and Garrick, I think coming back to what you were saying, how difficult it is to change things from within, is partly a result of these kind of ever expanding concentric circles of vested interest against changing what we're doing.
Fascinating. I think looking from the other side of the globe back at Britain and watching the disintegration of our empire, it's like the death throes. It's kind of horrible, but it's happening. And we know that all empires collapse at some stage, but most of us haven't lived through the empire that we grew up knowing about collapsing. And I think these fight backs, this denial is partly to do with that, because it's the it's the reality. It's just the way things are. This wonderful book that I was talking about earlier, Brilliant Black British History by Atinuka, who's a Nigerian author based in South Wales. And she found that her children hadn't got anything that they could read. So she decided to find out the best books to advise on, because she writes children's books anyway, mainly fictional books, and found there weren't any. So she put this together. And I know it's difficult looking on this big screen, but this was one of her pages, is about the British Empire. And she's just so straightforward in her explanations about how it happened, and then also follows that up with a double-page spread about the stolen riches in the context of Black British history. And I think that we can talk a lot about how our children, our young people must understand about Britain's role in slavery, but Britain's role in colonialisation in many ways was even more awful. And that takes a bit of understanding. But when you're hearing the television reports about the graves of the little children who were taken into care in Canada and died, and then you hear that story being replicated in other parts of the world where European colonization was going on, it really isn't a very easy story at all. But it's great that we're able to share it and understand and talk about it in this session. Jackie Pennant's joining us from Florida in the States. I think it's Florida, isn't it, Jackie? You have to
Yes,
unmute.
it's Florida.
Yeah, Florida.
Yes, it's
yeah.
Florida. Okay, yeah. So 2 points. First point is the colonial countryside that you mentioned. Wow, that was a really awesome presentation, educational presentation. I actually took the course online on that, and I can see where the countryside, the colonial countryside, all the wealth that's out there, it brought that. I mean, she really pinpointed how slavery and colonialism funded all of that. So, it was really, really an important project. But it's, I can see where if you're steeped in, British history, British traditionalism, conservatism, it really is. It really gives you an undeniable look where you have to relook at what you've been taught. Question, as far as a national apology, just thinking that, outside of having a national apology where you're going to create the environment where truths can be taught, if you don't have that, I don't think you have the environment to teach the way you want to, because there's no recognition of what happened. There's no acknowledgement of what happened. So just want to know what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Over to you first then, Alan.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant the way you put that, Jackie, that you need to create the environment where truth can be taught. And I think we have to think quite carefully about the tactics of doing so, of trying to create that environment. And I think it's fine for different people, depending on their different backgrounds, their different trajectories, to deploy different tactics. Certainly for me as a white guy, speaking within my white community, confrontation isn't necessarily always the best way to create that environment. Sometimes it is about persuasion, and persuasion involves some kind of sort of conversation, some kind of routine, which isn't directly challenging sort of in your face, which immediately puts people's backs up and enables them to dismiss what you then want to go on and say. So different ways of engagement pursued by different groups is one way forward. And one of the things that I think is good about so many white authors in this Truth About Empire book, they're not all white, but one of the things that's good about having white authors is that it needs to be said by white people as well as being said by black people. And certain white people who need to be brought into this more conducive environment at the moment are more predisposed to listen to white eminent historians than they are to black historians. At the moment, they're in a position where they can dismiss what black historians say as just coming from a certain positionality, rather than being the objective, empirical, academic truth, which they think they can recognize. So at certain points along the way, different groups saying different things is essential. And it doesn't always work. You can try to have a conversation with someone and someone will just not listen. But occasionally it does. And occasionally, I mean, I have this conversation with Satnam Sangera sometimes, who's positioned in a difficult way at the Times, you know, which is a conservative, broadly, newspaper, nowhere near like the Telegraph, which has just sold its soul to this kind of far right culture war. But the Times is still a difficult place to work if you're trying to have these kind of conversations, have truthful conversations about the colonial past. And you know, through that vehicle, though, I think personally it's important for Satnam to stay there and to carry on writing about the colonial past in a vehicle like the Times. I could easily understand why people might say that, you know, selling out by staying there, but I think it's essential to have these voices in different places and to pursue them through different ways, and to have white people saying these things to other white people, as well as black people campaigning, and those white people drawing attention to what those black people are saying and the campaigns that black people are engaged in. So that, you know, we can try and work in allies and think creatively about allyship and where it does work and where it doesn't work. And all too often, I'm very well aware it doesn't work. Sometimes, you know, white people will appropriate black voices, they'll ignore black voices, they'll center themselves at the expense of black people. So there's always a fine line to be discussed, I think, in the way that allyship works. But you know, my feeling is that if a community needs to be brought into that environment where the truth can be taught, then people within that community have a role to play too.
And it's interesting, thank you very much, Alan, there on all those points. It's interesting when you think about national apologies to look at where there are examples, heaven forbid there are few enough of them, but here in Australia, the national apology was made by the Prime Minister some few years back now, the apology for the stolen generations. These were the equivalent of the children who were put into the orphanages and schools in Canada and North America. This happened also here in Australia, and these generations, they were children were taken from their families and put into the mission schools. And the national apology was sorry. And we now have here in Australia a sorry day every year, an annual sorry day when we go through this story again. And it's through the media, like you're saying with Sangam Sagnera, with the Times, it's getting those articles, keeping on telling the story, getting the TV programmes there, I think is so important. Garrick, I'm going to go to you next, and then I want to make a comment about King Charles.
Thank you. Just to say the point that Alan just raised in terms of those different conversation in different audiences. One of the things that we promote on Black History Conversation, that after these conversation and presentation, the conversation doesn't stop. It moves out into various audiences, and whether that would be an academic audience or whether that would be a social informal audience. So we can take these conversations to different audiences at different time, and using our contacts and our social network and all other network, we can start to have these conversations. And you're absolutely right in terms of, you know, even in your white circle, you can still start to have a conversation about, you know, empire, and, you know, with your colleagues with over a pint, you know, did you know this? You know, did you realize this? You know, those conversations can happen. And often in the informal conversation, the audience is more receptive than in a, you know, a lecture theater, you presenting facts to them that they don't really want to hear.
I think that's very true. And I think it's a lovely thing about our conversations is because we can talk together and learn things, and we've got things to tell to other people. And I'm a great one for waving books around in front of the screen from our past speakers or interesting things. But I was just going to say, it was interesting when King Charles was challenged And at the same time, we've got the Church of England. We've had people from the Church of England group came to speak here. It was the only time that we've had, I think it was 71 or 72 people joined the session, but was to find out about what the Church of England was doing. But my point about King Charles is that how ridiculous is it that he's said that he is going to look into, you know, the possibility that the royal family might be in some way involved with the slave trade. Does not the name of the Royal Africa Company, does that not like give a hint? But it's, we've got to keep on with the press stories, and I mean the Guardian seem to be doing great work with their, is it called Cotton Conversation or something? I've got a slide about that later, but yes. So, but it's also knowing that these things are there so that people can learn and take the opportunity. And just to say, before anybody else gets a chance to get their hand up, we the North Wales Jamaica Society, we're going to run a course with the support from Learning Links International. And I'm chuckling about this course because we've been required to run a formal course in order to be eligible to access some Welsh Government funding for exchange visits to explore our shared history. And we'll be starting that course about our shared history a week on Saturday. So if anybody's interested in joining our course, then we'll be taking the subject fairly kind of informally, but we will get some speakers as well. And it's really important. And a lot of the things that we've learned through the conversations with our colleagues in Jamaica, with Ivor, with Vivian, they've just been so important to inform us, to have the confidence to be able to make such an offer. So with Garrick and others, I'm really proud we're able to do that. So thanks for that. Okay, right. Any other points? Vivian, you're coming in
Yes,
next.
I am so glad for the opportunity. I wanted to juxtapose Professor Allen's terrific presentation by telling him that we have come a very, very long way, because that presentation you gave this morning in 1944, a Jamaican, Roger Mays, you may Google him, Roger Mays, he gave a similar presentation. It was in writing, and he was sent to prison for 6 months for sedition. Wow, we have come a long way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we hope you're not going to be imprisoned as yet, Alan, but it's so important, though, that you're saying things. Okay, Rose, thanks very much indeed for you joining us. Vivian, tell me the surname of Roger's surname.
M-A-I-S.
M-A-I-S,
Roger Mays. He was at Calabar High School at the same time with Sir Philip Sherlock. He was the boy in the class with Roger Mays, and who asked his teacher, an Englishman, could we learn something about our Jamaican history, our West Indian history? And the teacher looked at him and said, boy, you have no history. That same boy became Sir Philip Sherlock, Vice Chancellor at the University of the West Indies. Don't joke with Master God. Don't joke with Master God.
Vivian, you're always welcome to repeat that one. And I'm going to ask you in a moment, Vivian, if you'll repeat the poem that you said earlier, and we can.
It's called a memory gem. It's called a memory gem, and I see Garrick laughing because he would have learned his memory gem. It's called a memory gem, and I'll say it slowly.
Okay, and then Alan, you're next, right?
Speak the truth and speak it ever. Cost it what it will. He who hides the wrong he did does the wrong thing still.
Thank you. Okay, Alan, over to you. We're all furiously writing here.
Sorry, I was just finishing writing off. That's the one you did, right? Yeah, and I was just going to say how important it is, again, in this right-wing populist backlash at the moment, to deny Black voices on history. And the role of Eric Williams's work is critical.
Capitalism and slavery.
Yeah, both in the reevaluation of his work that's going on among serious historians who are, uncovering more and more data that wasn't available to Williams, but that actually vindicates much of his analysis. Not all of it, but much of it. And because, historians, like, there's a book come out called Slavery, Capitalism and the Industrial Revolution by two, that's it, yeah, Maxine Berg and Pat Hudson, two British economic historians who never wrote about colonialism in the past. They wrote about the Industrial Revolution, looking at it as a kind of an indigenous affair, but have come to appreciate how significant the transatlantic slave system was. And in that book, they reevaluate Williams. They return to Williams, and they say that not every aspect of his thesis has been validated, but much of it has. Basically, to sort of simplify a bit, there's two theses within Williams's book. One of them is about how significant income and technology from the transatlantic slave system was to the Industrial Revolution. That's the bit that's being kind of revalidated through new data. The second part of Williams's thesis was that slavery was abolished only when it was becoming unprofitable, and that was why it was abolished. It was no longer economically profitable. That bit of the thesis is more doubtful. Slavery was still quite profitable at the time it was abolished. But in terms of that main sort of first part of the thesis, Williams is really pioneering work from the early 1940s is being revalidated. And much of the backlash that we're seeing now is against Williams, just as it was when he first published it. And when he first published it, academics rallied around the denial of his work, saying how implausible it was, how unrealistic it was to pursue this relationship. And the fact that, he was a Black independence leader from the Caribbean had a huge amount to do with that need to invalidate what he was saying then. And now that much of his work is being revindicated again, that need to invalidate it is even more pressing. So you'll see lots of right-wing think tank pieces and pieces in the Telegraph about how Williams was wrong and how it's been proven to be wrong, and how dare these woke academics revive debates that are long settled and past. It's been already cleared that Williams was wrong, and we're just being naive by going back to old debates. So yeah, just a point about how important it is to shut down Black academic insights as part of this right-wing backlash.
Okay, well, yeah, again, just these are really important things to talk through and to help us to understand. I just flashed this book up because Pat Hudson sent me a copy of this, Professor Pat Hudson, because we were working on a project to do with wool together, in the link with providing the fabric for transportation out through Liverpool and other places. And then Maxine Berg joined us one session as well, and spoke about Eric Williams, the importance of his work and the evidence that they'd found. And it's actually, it doesn't look a readable book, but it is actually very readable. So I say that as a non-academic and really somebody who didn't do an awful lot of reading before I got much involved in this. God, I've just got a couple of other books on my desk here. I come back to Australia worried that my luggage is overweight because it's got all these books in it. But we've been looking at the Liverpool slave trade because of our link with North Wales. And this is a very readable book, pictures in it and things. I like books with pictures in. So that's good. But we're going to be looking at practical ways that the that goods were transported out of Wales by pack horses to Liverpool. We're actually going to look at how the transport actually happened, the practicalities, because we feel that will link in to schools exploring their local connections with trade. And I can see a thumbs up there, Lucy. So I think it could be quite an interesting project. So we've been talking to folks on that front. But we've found, and this book's got so many bits attached to it, I'm ashamed to show it, Welsh ships and sailing men. Now, J. Geraint Jenkins wrote a lot about wool as well. So we picked up with that. But in that book, which goes around the Welsh coast, talking about the different ports, Wales got a huge coastline, and Welsh people were all around the world, and they weren't all around the world doing a whole lot of good. They were around the world doing all kinds of things. And one of the things that we discovered, just lying there on a page without any special note to it, was that they were building slave ships in Pwllheli. Now, if you know Pwllheli, it's a tourist place with used to have a Butlins there. I'm not sure if it's a Butlins now. And, and the idea of a guinea ship fitted out for, I think it's 580 bodies, it's just unbelievable. But the information is there if teachers can feel confident enough, well, feel they can find the information, and then are confident enough to be able to share that information, because, you know, the issues of the pushback, or whatever ways that you call it, are really quite serious. And, you know, to hear that David Olasuka has to have a bodyguard is just tragic. It's just unbelievable. And Atinuka, you know, show her big book again. Atinuka is also has had a lot of pressure back, and as you say, Satnam Sanghera also. So it's good that we have the opportunity to talk together and to support in any way. The only session that we ever had with Black History Conversations, which we didn't record, was because the speaker was afraid of his pushback professionally in his place of work. So, you know, and that's just tragic that you can't speak freely in Britain, for goodness sake, without fear of further implications. Well, we've taken a good bit of time. I don't know if anybody's got any other points you want to make. We've had quite a few of you being quite quiet. I don't know if Jonathan Greenland's listening in at the moment. Anyway, over to Alan.
So yeah, I'll just say one more thing, then I have to go anyway, actually.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really infuriates me is the backlash within academia itself, and the fact that there is this sort of cabal of largely retired right-wing historians who take it upon themselves in places like the Telegraph and on television to decry the work of younger, often black colleagues who are working on colonialism. And these historians never worked on colonialism during their careers. You know, they wrote histories of France, or they wrote histories of the early modern Mediterranean, and yet they rant against young, you know, junior colleagues trying to make their name in the profession, accusing them of telling lies and of being unprofessional and unacademic, and effectively ruin their careers before they've even got started, just because they're saying things that politically they don't find amenable. I think that's pretty disgusting. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you ever so much for having me, and thank you all of you for a really encouraging conversation. Sorry if I've spoken a bit too much, but I really appreciate all of your time.
Well, we're often here another time, so it's really great to be able to hear from you, and really appreciate your time. Absolutely brilliant. And Simon will be so delighted as he listens to the broadcast, because he was the one who said you need to get Alan Lester on. You need to get him talking. And we look forward to the book, and then we'll perhaps be able to invite you back later on in the year. That's lovely. And so many thank yous in the chat. Thanks, Alan, very much indeed. Okay, well, we'll wrap up now then. And fascinating, but it is concerning that there's that there are so many issues and challenges, and it's great that people are saying thank you in the chat. So if you want to be contacted about future Black History conversations, you can either contact me, that's lizmillman@yahoo.co.uk, or you can have a look on the overloaded Black History Conversations website, which is blackhistoryconversations.com, which has a lot of interesting bits and pieces on it, and it's got the link for future programs. So it's been really lovely to have some new names on the screen and new faces. So thank you very much, Savandra. It's been it's been great. And Joe, yes, and Fazil, thank you very much indeed. It's really, really lovely. So I think I was going to, Garrick, talk a little bit about the Windrush event in London, but June Elizabeth had to move on now, so we won't do that at the moment. Next week we're due to have an interesting session, but I've got to confirm it, which is about Jamaican as a language and respect and recognition for Jamaican. We've got a speaker who we worked with last summer in the UK, and also we're going to ask Joseph Farquharson, but I'm not sure whether I've organised it properly or not yet, so forgive me. I'll see how we get on with that next week, and then we'll then be moving towards May. And Garrick, we need to organise the programme if we want to focus on Windrush related stories during the time of the leaving, the departure from Kingston and the arrival in Tilbury. That worked quite well last year, so there are lots more things we can explore there and look forward to, and I'm looking forward to planning to get back to the UK over the summer, and who knows whether I'll get to Jamaica or not, Vivian. I explored the
You'll get your
airfare.
patties ready. You'll get your
Yes,
patties ready.
you'll get my patty ready, my Jamaican patty.
Your
Anyway,
patties.
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Lucy, it's a delight to have you join us again. It was really, really lovely because you've got a great insight there. Adrian, it was lovely that you were able to join us from Jamaica again. It's really good to see you. And thank you for sharing some of those stories again, because the reality of the challenges you faced when you spent a year at Bangor University need to be told again and again, because that's the reality. It was really difficult for you, I know. So anyway, good luck with what you're doing now. You're going from strength to strength, I keep hearing. So great to hear from mothers. Lovely that Jackie was able to join us from Florida. Ivor, good to see or have you join us again today. And we'll be chatting again next Thursday. We have a meeting when we meet up with colleagues in Penance, Jamaica. I don't think you've ever joined that, Jackie, have you? You're very welcome. It's the same time, but on a Thursday. Let me know if you want to join. And it's good to have had you, Joan, here again. That's really wonderful. And everybody else's names on here. And it was nice that Jonathan Greenland has been listening in, I expect, on driving on his way into work. So brilliant. Thanks so much. We didn't ask you at the beginning of the session to say a prayer, Vivian. Do you want to wrap the session up as you would in Jamaican terms with a prayer? Thank you
So we
so
say
much.
the prayer that was left on the moon by Buzz, given by James Dillett Freeman. So we say together in reverence to God. I'll say the prayer. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. The presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Vivian Crawford. Your contributions and presence at our sessions is so much valued. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll post this recording on the website. Thanks very much, everybody, and all the very best to you. Okay.